Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, and welcome back. Well, we have heard, as part of the Rabbi Louis J. Siegel Scholar in Residence Weekend, Rabbi Eric Wisnia speak about prayer in terms of his theology. Prayer doesn't change things. Prayer changes people, and people change things. And then this morning, we heard his take on Leviticus chapter 11 from this week's Torah portion with regard to the dietary laws and how they can be interpreted, but how they should be interpreted. And he gave us his view of that. This afternoon, we are going to continue, and today his topic is Torah and the nature of Torah, the proper way to interpret Torah. And so I welcome you back. Unlike last night, when we didn't really have time, it was getting late, we didn't have time for question and answer. Hey, we're going to have a little time for Q&A this afternoon, so if you think of something good, you can raise your hand and ask it in front of everybody. But first he's going to make a presentation about whether we take Torah literally or seriously, so it is my pleasure to reintroduce to you Rabbi Eric Wisnia.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Thank you for that applause. That's always kind. When I would take the bima in my own shul, they'd never applaud like that. Tough crowd, man. So, today we're going to talk about the fact that we Jews should take Torah seriously, but not always literally. The reality is that the Torah is written in Hebrew. Jesus didn't speak English, and neither did Moses. So that the Old Testament wasn't written in English, neither was the New Testament for that matter. So to understand the Jewish Torah, you have to understand Hebrew. And Hebrew is not like English at all. There's no relationship. Now, I'm going to do a little Hebrew pun with you, which Israelis think is hysterical. Americans look at me and say, what? I wrote on the board for you a quote from the prophet Isaiah. You all knew Isaiah, a famous boy. He was a big prophet of peace, right? And Isaiah said, Lo yisagoy el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Right? No. I can totally reinterpret that for you. You know what Isaiah really said? Let's divide it up a little differently. He said, Lo yisagoy. Do not exalt the neighbors around us. In fact, folks, el goy cherev, give them the sword. Why? Lo yilmedu, they'll never learn. Therefore, od milchama, there'll always be war. And you thought he was a prophet of peace? Now, of course, on Purim, that's funny. But if I interpret the Torah that way, I'm totally misinterpreting what Isaiah said. But I didn't have to change anything. I just had to put a comma in a different place. And the Torah is written without punctuation, without commas. If you want to understand our Torah, you have to understand who is speaking and who they are speaking to. Now, interestingly enough, our Torah was given to the Jews. This is good. Because when God created the world, what did God say? You remember Genesis chapter 1, verse 1? What did God say when God made the world? Let there be light. Well, he didn't say it in English, did he? He said, Yehi or. Why did he talk? Who was he talking to? Was there anybody there? And why did he speak Hebrew? You know, it's a good thing God spoke Hebrew. Because if he had said that in Japanese, my people never would have understood. So it's really a good thing that God spoke in Hebrew and said, Yehi or, let there be light. And of course, then God did a lot of creating. And when God did his creating, how long did it take him? Well, why do you say 6 days? Day is an English term. When does a day begin? What is a day? 24 hours? From 12 o'clock midnight to 12 o'clock midnight? No, not if you're a nice Jewish boy. If you're a nice Jewish boy, when does your day begin? In the evening at moon up. Not sundown. Moon up. Because we, being good Babylonians, see our world as a lunar world. So our day began at moon up. And the night was 12 hours, the Babylonian round number. 12 hours for the day, and then it ended. 24 hours from moon up to moon up. So when it says God created the world in 6, the Hebrew word is yom. What's a yom? Is it a day? Well, certainly not a 24-hour solar day. They didn't exist yet. And since God didn't get around to creating the sun and the moon until a few days down the road, how could there have been a 24-hour day to begin with? And then we have Psalm 90, verse 4. For in God's sight, 1,000 years are like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night. So a day to God is 1,000 years to man? Except it doesn't say years, it says shana. How long is a shana? Well, if you know your Babylonian calendar, which we Jews use, you'll know it's 354 days, not 365 solar days. You gotta start understanding like an old Jew who came out of Babylonia, because that's what our Torah was written by. Old Jewish white guys. So if you want to understand the Torah, you better understand these old Jewish white guys and their world. And you have to understand their language. When they say God made the world in 6 yoms and rested on the 7th, you have to ask, what does that mean? Actually, it means quite simply that God created the universe through an evolutionary process that had 6 stages. That's half the Babylonian round number of 12. So obviously God was a Babylonian. And what did we Jews add? The day of rest, Shabbat. Jews invented the weekend, and I personally take full credit for it. Are we to take this literally? That someone said, okay, Big G, we're going to create the world now. You got 24 hours, go, click. Nobody existed. Who wrote down this story of Genesis chapter 1? Who was there? When you read the Torah, you have to ask yourself, what are they trying to tell me? We have to take Torah seriously, but you can't take it literally. The word day doesn't mean what you think it does. The word Shana doesn't mean what you think it does. And when it says, and God said, right, that's a biggie. What does that mean? Did God talk? Does God have a voice like I have a voice? I'm talking to you. You hear me with human ears? When it says, and God said to Moses, as our Torah portion started this morning, God said to Moses and Aaron, did they hear him talk? Do you know that it could mean, instead of, and God spoke to Moses and Aaron, it could mean, and God caused Moses and Aaron to understand? That's a perfectly good reading and translation of the Torah. God caused them to understand. He didn't talk, didn't say a word, doesn't have a voice. But you and I have grown up in a Christian world where the fundamentalists have perverted our Torah. They've taught us how to look at Torah, and they don't look at it the right way. They take it very literally. And it is not to be meant literally. Hebrew cannot be taken literally. Hebrew is a very sparse language. Do you know in Hebrew, you can't like, in the biblical verses, you can't like anybody. You either love them or hate them. You can't like them. There's no word for that. There's also no word for religion in the Torah. You could be a Babylonian, you could be a Hebrew, you could be an Egyptian, but you can't practice the Jewish religion because that concept doesn't exist. The Hebrew Bible was not meant to be read in English. When you read it in English, you are reading somebody's translation. And unfortunately, the translations are not usually too good, because they make it seem like God is Big Daddy in the sky. And God talks. And we listen with human ears. Now, one of my favorite parts of the Torah, which people question, is God says in the book of Leviticus and also in Exodus, he says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You all know that part? Famous. What does that mean? Does it mean if I poke your eye out, you poke my eye out? Well, what if I poke your eye out and I'm blind? What good does it do you to poke my eye out? I don't have an eye to lose. Does that mean I can't be punished? Or what if you did poke my eye out, supposing you poked my eye out and I had a loss of blood and died? Have you violated the Torah? You've committed murder? What does it mean, an eye for an eye? The rabbis of ancient days read this and said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You can't take it literally. Take it figuratively. They translated it an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, lo mamash ela mamon. Not literally, money, damages. If I knock your eye out, I have to pay you the equivalent of an eye, and the courts will determine what that eye is worth. Because we can't do it literally. In fact, the rabbis interpret Torah this way. They look at the Hebrew and say, what does it mean? And in fact, we believe that every Hebrew word has at least 4 possible translations, sometimes very many more. There's a literal translation, there's a figurative translation, an allegorical translation, a mystical translation, all of which is exactly in the text. And the nice thing about being a Jew is when you read Torah, you have to translate it. You have to interpret. Or you can find yourself a nice rabbi to do it for you. When I used to do Torah for Rosh Hashanah, I would always read the Akedah. And one year, I would take the position, Abraham failed the test. He was willing to sacrifice his son on the altar of his good intentions. And the next year, I would talk about the Akedah and say, Abraham passed the test because he was willing to put his posterity, his future on the line for God. And one day, a perceptive congregant came up to me and said, you know, Rabbi, I paid attention last year. You said the exact opposite. I said, good for you. Which one did you like better? Because both interpretations are there. The question is, what do you need to hear? One of the great Hasidic Ravs of Europe said, on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, every Jew should have two pieces of paper, one in one pocket, one in the other pocket. And on one pocket should be a piece of paper that said, God made the world just for me. And in the other pocket should be a piece of paper that says, I am nothing but dust and ash. And then on Yom Kippur, you should decide which paper you need to read. If you're depressed and feeling rotten, God made the world just for you. Cheer up, kiddo, it gets better. And if you're feeling too self-content and self-righteous and entitled, then read the paper that says, I'm dust and ash, because you can't take it with you. So you better make a better world for your posterity. The question is not which one is right. They're both right. The question is, which one do you need to hear? We take our Torah seriously. We have to learn from it. Each and every story we learn from. Now, let's examine two stories. Exodus chapter 33. Famous story. Moses is talking, you know the whole story of the golden calf, and Moses is a little annoyed because the Jews have been paying attention, and God has smited us a mighty smiting. And Moses says, you know, God, this is getting to be a pain, these Jews. Really. And God says, yeah, but you're doing a good job, Mo, keep it up. And Moses says to God, you know, boss, I want to see your face. Exodus chapter 33. I want to see your face. You know, here I am, I'm your boy. We talk, you give me all these mitzvahs. I want to see your face. And God laughs and says, you can't. And Moses says, what do you mean I can't? I want to see. And God says to him, look at the world. You'll see all the goodness in the world. That's me. Moses says, hey, you don't get off that easy. Come on, show me your face. And God says to him, fascinating story. He says, all right, Mo, you want to see my face? Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you over here where the rocks are, and there's a cleft in the rocks. And I want you to, put your eyes right behind the cleft there and look out. And then God says to him, and I'm going to walk by. And when I walk by, I'm going to take my hand and put it over the cleft till I get past. And then I'm going to remove my hand, and you can look at my back. Is this not the strangest story you ever heard? Number one, God's having a conversation with Moses like I'm having a conversation with you. Number two, God has a hand. God has a back. God has a face. And what is he, so ugly that you can't see it? So awesome that you can't see it? If you take this story literally, you missed the point. No, God doesn't have a hand, and God doesn't have a back, and God doesn't have a face, and the story probably never happened, but that's irrelevant. Because this is a powerfully important story. Moses wants to see God's face. And he's the closest person to God. He's God's boy. And God says to him, you can't see me. I'm not a big daddy in the sky. Moses says, but I need to. And God says to him, you can see my back. Now think about that for a moment. When I look in your face, we're all just getting out of wearing masks, right? I mean, you know what it is when you look at somebody's face and he's wearing a mask. You're not even sure who it is half the time. And that when I look in your face, in your eyes, and I see your expression, I can pretty much tell what's going on in there. But what happens when I see your back? I can hardly even know it's you. I can see a vague outline, but I really can't understand. And that's what God is telling Moses. You can't see God. God's not a person. God doesn't have a face. This is an allegory, Mo. You want to see me? Look at the goodness of the universe. That's God. You want to see God? You know what I tell people? Look in the eyes of someone who loves you, and you'll see God. Look in the eyes of someone who helps you when you didn't expect it, and you'll see God. Look in the eyes of those Ukrainian refugees we see on the news every day who come to Poland or Czechia or Slovakia or Romania, and they get a hot meal and they get some stranger being nice to them. Look in their eyes, they see God. God is the goodness of the universe. God is not Big Daddy in the sky. That's what Exodus 33 tells us. Stop trying to see God as a person. God is the goodness of the universe. And then, of course, we have my other favorite story about God. It's the book of Numbers, chapter 9. Some people come to Moses, and it's getting near Passover. It's getting near the first anniversary of Passover, so this will be the second Passover we've celebrated, the first one in the desert. And of course, to celebrate Pesach, you have to make the Pesach sacrifice, and you have to be pure. These people, one of their parents has died recently, and they had to attend to the dead body, bury their dead, which is a mitzvah. You have to do that. It's a good thing, but it makes you ritually unclean. You can't make the Passover sacrifice when you're ritually unclean. So they come to Moses and they say, Mo, what are we going to do? It's almost Pesach. We have to make Pesach. We can't make Pesach because we're impure and we got to wait a month to get pure again. So what do we do? And Moses, like many a good rabbi, strokes his beard and says, let me ask the boss. Let me consult the sources. So he goes into the tent of meeting and he says to God, he says, Big G, we got tsuris. We got problems here. We're supposed to do Pesach. It's very important, Passover. One of the most important things to do. If you don't do Pesach, you've taken yourself out of the Jewish people, the Torah tells us. But they're not ritually clean. They can't do Pesach. So what do, God? God says to Moses, good question. Let me sleep on it. I'll tell you in the morning. Great rabbinic answer. If God could get away with it, we rabbis have been able to get away with it. God comes back in the morning and says to Moses, and the rabbis say God didn't know the answer. The other rabbis say, of course he knew the answer, but he was telling rabbis, sometimes you delay, you think about it, So he comes back to Moses and he says, here's what you do, Mo. Tell these people that they should do Passover a month late. The book of Numbers, chapter 9, verse 9 through 14. Look it up because people don't believe me. God says to Moses, if you can't do it perfectly, don't not do it. Do the best you can. Do it a month later. Have what they call Pesach Sheni. And God goes even further. He says, Mo, now that we're talking about it, if you're traveling to a foreign country and you can't be with your mishpacha and do Pesach, do it a month later. If you're a sailor on the sail, you do the best you can. You don't have to do it perfectly, Mo. God says this to Moses. Now, of course, I used to load the dishwasher for my wife. And I will admit to never learning her method, so I would never do it right. And she, of course, would say, if you can't do it right, don't do it at all. Please don't tell her I said this. I hope you're not watching, honey. If you can't do it right, don't do it at all. I immediately thought of Numbers chapter 9, and God telling Moses, no! If you can't do it right, do the best you can. Later, what's important is to try. Do the best you can. Now, is this story literally true? Did God and Moses have this conversation? I don't know, folks. I wasn't there. But my suggestion to you is that we take our Torah seriously, not necessarily literally. Whether God and Moses actually had this conversation is pretty much irrelevant, because it's in the Torah for a reason, to teach you and I that if you can't do it perfectly, at least do the best you can. Do it a month later. Try. If you can't tell perfect truth, do the best you can. Rabbis are allowed to lie. Really. It says in the Talmud that when you see a newborn baby, you're supposed to say, this baby is gorgeous. When you see a bride, the bride is beautiful. Don't look at the bride, just say, the bride is beautiful. Also, at Jewish weddings, all brides are virgins, too. That's another thing we rabbis are required by law to say. We won't get into that. But the fact is that perfect truth isn't always necessary. Oh my God, that kid is a gorilla. It's ugly. You don't say that. There's no point in saying that. The trick is to try and do good, and that's what we learn from our Torah. That you don't take it literally. You don't do an eye for an eye. You do an eye for an eye figuratively. In other words, if I knock your eye out, I have to pay you damages equal to an eye. If you are a famous portrait artist and I damage your right hand, what are you going to do? You're going to cut off my right hand? I couldn't draw a straight line if I tried, and I'm left-handed anyway. Is my right hand worth the artist's right hand? No. What the Torah really means is you pay the equivalent of the damages that you did. So in reality, how does one translate an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? The punishment must fit the crime. The punishment must fit the crime. When you read Isaiah, can you read it the stupid way I read it? Yeah, kill the goyim. No! That's so un-Jewish, it's terrible. He meant peace with our neighbors. Treat them with love and kindness. We take the meaning and put it into our lives. Reading the Torah literally, does God talk? We don't have to believe God talks. Remember, when it says God made the world in 6 yoms, it doesn't mean 6 24-hour days. God created the world in 6 stages. We now have to interpret what that means. Actually, there's evolution in Genesis chapter 1. Each stage of evolution, which lasted maybe 60 billion years, I don't know. It doesn't matter. What Genesis 1 teaches us is not that God made the world in 6 days, but that God made the world and it's not an accident. It's not a mistake. It's purposeful. There's a plan. Therefore, take good care of it, because in the end, what does God do? God says to male and female, I give it to you. It is yours. It is a present. Take good care of it, because you're not getting another one. Is this literally true? It doesn't matter whether it's literally true. I'll end, and then I'll take some questions, with a story that my good friend Rabbi Johnny Nyman told me, who just passed away. Alav HaShalom. And Johnny was listening to a tape by the Chief Orthodox Rabbi of England. He was teaching Bible 101 to his Orthodox rabbinic students. And he said to them, is the Bible literally the Word of God? And they said, oh yes, oh yes. And the rabbi said to them, God wrote it? And they said, uh-huh, he wrote it. He said, God publishes books now? And I said, uh-huh, yeah. All right, so he said to them, so in the Bible, there are some poems. Did God write that poetry? And they got a little nervous, and I said, well, if God wrote the Torah, I guess he wrote the poems. And he said, well, if God is omnipotent, God can write poems, can't God? And they said, I guess that's true. He said, how about parables? What if God wanted to write a parable? Could God do that? And they were horrified. They said, what do you mean? No, every word in the Torah is literally true. The talking donkey of Bil'am in the book of Numbers. It's got to be literally true. It's in the Torah. He said, but what if God wanted to write a parable? I mean, Aesop was writing parables. Maybe God saw that and God said, well, the Greeks like that stuff. Maybe the Jews will like it. Maybe I should write a parable for my Jews and see how they react. And he said to them, if God wanted to, could God do that? And they all said, well, I suppose. And he said, so the Bible may have parables in it? That you don't have to take literally, like the donkey didn't really talk? And they just couldn't accept it because they were so committed to the idea that we have to take Torah literally. And traditional Judaism and Reform Judaism and modern Judaism all say, don't take the Torah literally, take it seriously. Understand the Hebrew. What are the parameters of the Hebrew? What does it mean? And particularly, how did the people who heard it translate it? Now, I'm going to stop here and take some questions because I know I've said some controversial things. Anybody have any questions? Anybody want any rebuttal? Otherwise, I'll go on talking.
So we can take questions from folks who are here in the congregation. If you're watching us on live stream, we don't have real-time access to the things that are posted in the comment section. So we can't take virtual questions, but we can take real questions or comments.
Yes, please. So is this a new idea to you? Because when I have fundamentalists, they say to me, you must take the Torah literally. And I say, why? How do you take it literally? In Hebrew, remember I said the word that in Bible, you can't say, I like you. I either love you or hate you. And love has nothing to do with sex. That's a totally different word. So, Jacob, you know, he actually loved his wife, Rachel. The Bible's shocked. They can't get over that. He actually loved her. Nobody loved each other. They didn't talk like that. You have to translate the Bible from the world that stood in. I heard somebody once explain to me why Jews wear yarmulke. And it's nothing to do with my concept of a yid lid, that I put a lid on top of me. I only go up to here and I stop. There's a higher authority. They said to me, well, and where did you Jews grow up? And I said, we're the wild and crazy boys from the desert. And they said, and where did you pray to your God? I said, well, you didn't do it in the tent, you went outside. He said, so let me see. You'd go outside to talk to God, yeah, and you stand out in the desert sun. How long did you stand there? I said, probably 1 minute before we put something on our heads, yeah. Of course we put something on our heads when you talk to God. If you're out in the desert, you do that. If you read our Torah, it is a horribly sexist document. Who wrote it? Bunch of old Jewish white guys. Well, actually, probably brown guys, but you know. But women didn't write the Torah. In fact, it's amazing when you look at our society that we gave women rights at all. The Babylonians didn't. They treated their animals better than their females. The fact that the Jews give rights to women is an amazing idea and says something about our society. Not that we were egalitarian, we weren't yet, but we were on the road, we were trying. When you look at Hebrew words, you have to try and interpret what they mean. They don't mean the same thing that they mean in English. You all speak English. So when I say to you, Waterloo was Richard Nixon's Watergate. Excuse me, Watergate was Richard Nixon's Waterloo. Did I say anything about water? No. But you understand my cultural context. When I say Watergate was Nixon's Waterloo, you know that I said nothing about water. So if someone said to you, well, what's he talking about water for? You'd say, he's not. And they'll say, but I heard him say the word. English has idioms. The Bible has idioms. One of my favorites is the number 40. The number 40 in Torah does not mean 39 plus 1. Oh, it could, but not necessarily. When you ask me, how many people were at services last night? And I say, oh, about 100. Are you going to come to me later and say, you know, Rabbi, I counted there were only 89, you lied? I'm going to say, no, I told you 100. You should know when I say 100, I am estimating. I am not telling you I counted. If I were to tell you, oh, there were 76 people there, that number you'd know meant something very different in English, right? You'd say, oh, he must have counted, or someone did. Because the number 76 is not the number he would round off to. The number 100 is. We have our idioms in English. They have idioms in Hebrew, the number 40. How many days was Moses up on Mount Sinai talking to God? 40 days and 40 nights. How many years did we wander in the desert? 40 years. How many days did it rain on Noah? 40 days and 40 nights. How many years we were slaves in Egypt? 400 years. That's a hell of a long time. 40 just means a long time. 400 is a very long time. It doesn't mean 39 plus 1. It means a long time. So how long did it rain on Noah? A long time. It does not mean you count 40 days and take that literally. That's not what the Hebrew is telling you. You have to understand Hebrew very often uses a form called hendiadys, the big and the little. Well, what about the middle-sized people? Not them? No, boo-boo. The big and the little means everybody. I gave you the two extremes and it counts everybody in the middle too. The young and the old. This Hebrew expression Doesn't mean we singled out the young people and the old people and all the middle-aged people weren't invited. It means everybody. This is a Hebrew idiom. We have our idioms in English. One of my favorite is, a man walked down the street and turned into a store. Think about that. It's frightening. But you know what I mean. You speak my language. Unless you understand Hebrew, you'll never understand what we meant in the Torah. Yes, sir.
Is there an English? Wait.
Oh.
I have to turn on camera 2. I have to bring you the microphone. Now you can ask me.
Is there an English translation out there that you believe is close enough?
Yes, well, I believe that the JPS, the new JPS translation, is relatively good. It's relatively good. But the problem is you have to understand, whenever you're reading the Torah in English, you're reading somebody's interpretation. And I try and tell this to my Christian friends. They have a lot of problems with this because they're convinced that Jesus spoke English. And I try and tell them that English wasn't invented yet, and the Torah is written in Hebrew. So unless you're going to read it in the original, you won't understand it. Because Christians have their own interpretation. They have an agenda. The New English JPS translation tries to be literal. But again, then you have to interpret it and realize that they're being literal to the Hebrew. That doesn't mean that's what the Hebrew means, like an eye for an eye. It does, the rabbis specifically said, it doesn't mean I poke your eye out if you poke my eye out. It means punishment must fit the crime. And this is so much of our Torah. Yes, ma'am. Oh, are you, Stephen?
I was taught that if you're dealing with an ugly baby, the correct thing to say is, that's some baby.
Definitely. Looks just like his mother, really.
The rabbis of the Talmud, did they start out with a literal interpretation and then talk about it? Or did they right away say this is not meant to be taken literally?
Well, it depends. First of all, the rabbis were very clear that you have to interpret Torah so that there is a literal interpretation, but then you can go beyond that and go to an allegorical interpretation. Or sometimes the literal interpretation is, Moses said do Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. Okay, well, 14th of Nisan. Now, does that mean if you don't do it on the 14th of Nisan, you've sinned? No, because in number 9, we find you can do it on the 14th of Iyar a month later. But the rabbis of the Talmud are very careful. In fact, we developed an entire genre of literature called Midrash, in which you take all the Torah stories and you retell them. You tell them. Sometimes you make them, like I did with the binding of Isaac. Sometimes he passed the test, sometimes he didn't pass the test. Depends on the sermon you want to give. When I was in rabbinic school, we used to call that's not a sermon based on a text, that's a pretext.
So my mama over here would say, if you see an ugly baby, you say, what a pretty blanket.
That's also a very good approach. I like that.
Who do you get most resistance and pushback from regarding your presentation?
Well, the funny thing is, I get a lot of resistance from a lot of people who are Jews who don't take Judaism in a liberal point of view. They take it in a didactic point of view. I have a, they can't accept, as that Orthodox Rav found, that maybe God wrote a parable. What do you mean God wrote a parable? No, God wouldn't do that. God literally wrote the Torah, and this is what it means. That's not a Jewish point of view. That's a fundamentalist Christian point of view. So I find, yes, a lot of Jews have trouble with that. I remember arguing with Chabad about chicken and kashrut. And I said, well, on Shabbat 113a, I believe, I'm not sure, but I think it's 113a, they tell the story of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who used to make a big fancy dish. He thought he was a big cook, and he would make pheasant head in milk. He would mix meat and milk. He wouldn't cook a baby cow in its mother's milk, or a baby goat in its mother's milk. But he said birds are not mammals, so mothers don't have milk. You could eat them with milk. And the rabbis voted, and they said, no, we voted, and it looks like meat, therefore you got to count it as meat. And one of the students says to them, well, that's nice, you boys voted. I'm going to visit Yossi. And I'm going to be in his house, and Yossi's a big cook, and he's going to serve it to me. And what am I supposed to say? Well, Rabbi Yossi, all the little pishers back in Jerusalem voted we can't do this anymore. And they said, okay, second vote. In the house of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, you can have chicken with milk. Everywhere else, you can't. The Talmud is a fascinating book, but it tells this reality. And yeah, the rabbis knew what they were doing. They were making fences. They were making laws to live by. They were taking, there's a wonderful story about Korach and his rebellion. And if Korach uses his mouth to badmouth Moses and Aaron, and I use that phrase advisedly, he badmouths Moses and Aaron. And you know what happens to him at the end? The earth opens up, and the Bible says, and the mouth of the earth swallowed them up. He who lives by the bad mouth dies by the bad mouth. Wonderful story in Torah. Did it literally happen? I don't know. I wasn't there. All I know is I love that story. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left.
So with regard to interfaith relations and interpretations of the Bible, I want to see if you've come across this, because I've had a couple of brief conversations about the phrase inspired, right? So the Torah may not be written by God, but it's inspired by God. And for us Jews, that is a euphemism for not taking the Torah literally, but to take it seriously. Right. But when Christians say it's inspired by God, that is the reason to take it literally. And have you come across...
Yes.
It means that you can't even take this word inspired literally, because it means two different things to two different groups of people.
And that's really the issue. It's that when you read the Hebrew, you realize it demands interpretation. Hebrew as a language, to translate from Hebrew to English, there is no present tense in the biblical Hebrew. It's all mi Tarzan, Eugene, Abraham good, Ishmael bad. There's no is. So if you're translating into English, you have to be a little creative. In Hebrew, you can say the king kinged over the kingdom. In fact, that's how they'd say it. Hamelech molech al hamamlacha. Well, in English, you wouldn't say that. They say, we have other words too. So how does one translate that into English? The ruler dominated his kingdom. The prince ruled over the people. All these are legitimate translations. In fact, in many Hebrew verses, Hebrew is written, each verse of the Torah has an A half and a B half. And very often, in a poetic license in the book of Psalms particularly, the A half of the sentence will be, the king ruled over his empire, And the B half will be the prince ruled over his people. And when you read this, if you're reading the Hebrew, you say, okay, some powerful guy ruled over some people. Which one's right? They're both right. It's poetic. So in other words, you have to understand the Hebrew and get to the point of what is it saying. The reason we study Torah is because it has in it our laws, our morality, our history, and our point of view. And therefore, you should learn it. Rabbi Ben Bagbag, the kids sing this song. Rabbi Ben Bagbag. Hafoch ba v'hafoch ba dechula abba. He spoke Aramaic. Turn it and turn it, because it's a scroll. Turn it and turn it because everything is in it. Interpret it. Read it and say, what is it trying to tell me? Don't ask the question, is it literally true? It doesn't matter whether it's literally true. You think that Abraham's conversations with God personally are transcribed? Nobody stood there with a tape recorder and said, go God, you're on. This is what our ancestors wanted us to study. So study it and figure out what they're trying to tell you. Any last questions? In that case, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Rabbi Eric Wisnia. So I'm just going to offer a couple of thank yous. Just wanted to do a quick acknowledgement. So, I would just want to remind everyone that we have one more session with Rabbi Wisnia tomorrow morning. The bagel brunch for those who've reserved a place will begin at 10 a.m. And then Rabbi Wisnia will speak here in the sanctuary and on live stream at 11 a.m. tomorrow. And we were talking about second Passover. So now second Passover is not to be confused with the second night of Passover. And speaking of the second night of Passover, I figure I'd give this one announcement, which is our second night Passover Seder is going to resume after a hiatus of 2 years because of COVID on April 16th at 6 p.m. Temple COVID protocols in place at that time will be in effect with the caveat that children under 5 who are not eligible to be vaccinated will be permitted to attend, and they will sit with their families at a separate table. And so you can go online. Most of you should have gotten a text from me on Thursday afternoon. Nod if you got a text from me. More people than I thought, fewer people than I'd hoped. And so anyway, but it's also on our website, so we hope that you will register ASAP for the second night Passover Seder. As we're preparing to conclude, then it is your last chance, if you're watching us on live stream, to post a comment or chat in the live stream platform. And I want to take a moment to thank the volunteers in the live stream control booth this afternoon. Amanda Eastman and Pauline Hecht were at the controls to make sure that everybody out there on the internet could see and hear everything that went on here in the sanctuary this afternoon. So with that said, we'll see everyone tomorrow morning as we conclude our Scholar in Residence weekend. Shabbat Shalom.